Hello all my friends. I have got another paint along video for you. I think I had told several of you I was going to do a Valentine's video and I didn't get that done, and I am so sorry. We are still having to travel quite a bit to care for an elderly relative, and I thought we had some of that squared away, but some things fell through, so we've been traveling again, and I did not get a Valentine's Day one done, but I still wanted to have something new for y'all. I don't know about where you guys are, but the weather here in Idaho is still very wintry, and I'm kind of over it. I've been dreaming of spring. And in that dreaming of spring, I started thinking about warm, late summer spring mornings with the sun coming up and all the new green leaves. And I came up with a project around that then turned into a two-piece project. So you're going to get a twofer today. We're going to do a spring scene and a night scene, and we're going to do them both on the same piece of paper. So for this project, I have got two round paintbrushes. One's bigger than the other, but they are both rounds. This one I think is a number 10 and this one's a number 6. So something in that vicinity. You could also do this with a flat brush if you wanted to, but I think these two are going to work nicely for what we're going to do. So I've got my two brushes. I've got a couple of black pens, different size tips. The ones I like to use are the Uniball I Fine and the Uniball Deluxe Micro. The Fine has a little bigger tip than the Micro, but they are both black waterproof pens. So even though most of what we're going to be doing with these is going to be after we paint, I like to use the waterproof ones in case I decide I want to go back and paint something over the top. So having a couple good black waterproof pens in your supplies is always a good idea in my book. I've also got my white Posca pen because I want to do some white accents on parts of this, and I like the Posca paint pen because it's an acrylic paint pen, but because it's acrylic, it's a real nice opaque white. There are other white pens that you can use. You just generally don't get quite that nice crisp white, so I like the Posca pen. This one is a fine tip 0.7 millimeter. And then I've got a pencil and eraser, my tape, something to draw a circle around, and watercolor paper. I'm using 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. I've already taped it down to my board. And those of you who've seen past videos know that I like to use these little canvas boards, and I just tape my paper to the back because they're nice and light. They move around real easy and they're cheap to buy. So I've got my paper already taped down. I do want to put one more piece of tape right up the middle because, like I mentioned, we're going to do, this is going to be kind of spring themed, but we're going to do a sunrise and a nighttime version. So I'm going to split this in half so that I can do one on each side. I am using 9x12 paper. You can use whatever size paper you have. You'll just scale everything down accordingly. The tape I like to use is Scotch Wall Safe tape, and I like this because it rips the paper less. You can use masking tape, you can use painter's tape. Just keep in mind that if you have a tape that's really sticky, you might want to pull a piece of it off and stick it to the leg of your pants or to the front of your shirt, something like that first to get a little bit of fuzz on it so that it's not quite so sticky when you put it on the paper. So I just ran that piece of tape right up what appears to be the middle of the paper. I didn't measure it, and hopefully with the light a little different you can see where that tape is. I didn't measure it, I'm just eyeballing it. If you wanted to be exact, you could measure to the center of your paper and put that tape right down the center, but it's pretty close, and that will be close enough for what we're going to do today. I have my watercolors, and I have a couple of white plates that we're going to use to mix things on. You technically only need one plate, but because the watercolors wash off of here so easy, and just for my own time saving while I'm doing the video, I've got two because I'm going to use two very different color palettes. I like to use just plain white dinner plates. Watercolor washes off of those really easily. The watercolor set I'm using is my Art Philosophy Tropicals set. I know a lot of you have the Art Philosophy paints in this particular set, so that's the one I'm going to use. While we're getting started with the painting, I am going to put some water in a few of these wells so that my paints can start softening up. For my daytime scene, I'm going to use pink, yellow, and the blue in this set that's called Hurricane. It's the lighter of the two blues. And I'm probably going to use a little bit of green as well. So I like to use these little droppers. If you don't have a little dropper, and you can get these things on Amazon by the dozens. If you don't have a little dropper, you could use your paintbrush, just dip it in water and then let it drip in the paint. Or you could use a spray bottle and just spritz the top of your paints. Since I do have this little dropper that I like, I'm just putting a little bit of water in my pink, my yellow, my green, my blue. I am going to use the darker blue, the purple, and the pink for my nighttime scene. So I'm going to put a little bit of water in them as well. And I'm going to set that aside while we're getting this going. And all that's going to do is let those paints start to soften up. So I'm just going to set that off to the side for right now while we make some marks on our paper to govern where we're going to paint. This side for me is going to be my daytime. This is going to be my nighttime. On the daytime one, on both of them, we're essentially going to create layers working up to a sun, and then layers working up to a moon sky. And we're going to have these layers be different shapes, but I'm not going to draw out those shapes. We're going to kind of do that on the fly. So the only thing I'm going to mark at the top of these is where my horizon line is. And I'm going to do them both at the same time by just making kind of a squiggly line across there, about 2/3 of the way up my page. So that's going to be my horizon line. And I do want to make myself a sun on one side and a moon on the other side. So that's where this comes in. I'm just going to use that as a circle tool to trace around it. You could certainly freehand a circle if you want to. Just for the ease of making sure it's a pretty good circle, I'm going to use this to draw around. So depending on the size of your paper, what you choose to draw around, just make sure that it's sized appropriately for the paper that you have. I'm not making a full circle on top. I'm doing partial circle so that it looks like on this side it's going to be the sun coming up, on this side it's going to be the moon coming up. Okay? I did mine pretty dark so that you could see them at least here initially. If yours have turned out pretty dark, do what I'm going to do here. I'm just taking my eraser and I'm going to run my eraser over it lightly so that all I have left is just a little shadow, a little trace of where those lines were, because I don't really want those lines to show in my final product. And if I get those lines wet and paint over them, then they will be there forever. You can't erase it once you've painted over it. So I just erased those, and I know from this distance you can hardly see it. If I hold it close up, you can see there's just a little bit of a trace of those. If I were doing this and not videoing it, I would have just drawn them very lightly to begin with. So I've got my horizon line marked, I've got my sun, my moon, so I'm going to start painting down here. Now on this side, because that's going to be my daytime side, I'm going to use real springy colors, yellow, pink. The combination of the two of those is going to make some oranges. And I'm also going to throw a little bit of green in there. So what I want to do is take one of my plates, and I'm going to bring my paints back over here, and I'm just going to put little splops of paint on here so that I can mix them together and I can water them down a little bit, because I want some to be darker than others. And in order to do that, you need to water them down. And the easiest way to do that is not to do it here straight onto the paper, because you're going to get a whole lot of pigment on your brush. Put it on a plate, and then you can add water to the paint that's on the plate to thin it down and lighten it up however you want it. So I'm going to get my brush wet to start with, and I'm just going to start making some puddles of paint. So I'm starting with my pink. And if you don't have this exact palette, that's fine. Just use whatever pink, yellow, light green, and blues that you have. So I'm going to make a couple of puddles of pink. I'm going to rinse my brush off real good, and I'm going to make a couple puddles of yellow. So all I'm doing is just swirling my brush around in those colors that I already put some water in. If they do feel like they've dried out a little bit, even though you put some water in them, just dip your brush in water and put a little bit more water in there. And then I'm just dabbing my brush on the plate so that it makes puddles of paint. And I'm going to use those to mix from. I'm going to rinse my brush and grab a little bit of the green. And I'm only going to make one puddle of green because I'm just going to use that kind of as an accent color here and there. If I need more green, I can go back to my pan and get it. And then I'm going to put a little bit of blue, and I'm only going to make one puddle of blue as well, because the blue is only going to be for my sky. And I want it to be really light, so I don't need a ton of it. And I'm going to set my palette aside completely. So I'm going to paint off of here. Okay? So I'm going to set this to the side, or hopefully you can still see it. In my mind, I want my bottom layer to be kind of pretty dark pink. Actually, take that back. I'm going to make pink my top layer, and I'm going to let my bottom layer be kind of a light yellow, and then I'm going to play with shades of those in between and mix them together and make some oranges in there as well. So I'm going to do my top and bottom ones to start with. So if I'm going to have pink at the top, I'm going to get my brush really, really wet and just drag out a little bit of this pink paint and mix it with the water. And I'm going to dip my brush again and put some more water in it. And as I drag this out with water in it, that pink is going to get lighter and lighter and lighter. So that I'm going to take that light pink and I'm going to follow my horizon line that I painted. And I'm just going to kind of make a swoop. And fill that swoop in with some pink. I want to add a little bit of fun to this, so I'm going to rinse off my brush, and I'm going to bring it back with just clean water on my brush and just dab it here and there in that wet pink. And it's going to make blooms. Hopefully you can see where it made those little white splotches. Those are called blooms because the water pushes the paint aside. And that's just going to give a little bit of a, like an illusion of texture and something fun there. I want my yellow to be down at the bottom, so I'm going to do the same thing. With a clean, wet brush, I'm going to come over to my plate and just drag a little bit of that yellow out. And keep going back and grabbing water and mixing it in until it thins it out enough that I've got a nice light yellow. And I'm going to do the same thing down here at the bottom, but I'm not going to have it be the exact same contour shape. So I'm going to do a little bit of a different shape. And I'm just going to paint that all in with the yellow. If it looks like your paper is starting to dry out as you're painting, you can dip your brush in a little bit of water. Get that all filled in with yellow. Now here's where I'm going to add in a little bit of accent of green. I washed my brush and I'm going to come over and just put the tip of my brush in the green and just kind of dot some green around the edges of my yellow. And then you can use your brush to kind of spread that green around just a little bit. So what I'm going to end up with is little bits of green here and there. Just gives it a little bit of contouring, a little bit of shading, and brings in some of that green color for spring. Okay? So now between these two, I'm going to keep doing that same thing all the way up. Only I'm going to vary the shape of my contours so they kind of look almost like, you know, how mountains do this, but they're all different shapes. And I'm going to start mixing my colors over here so that I can get some oranges. If you mix that pink and yellow, you're going to get some oranges. I might mix my yellow and my green and get a little more yellowy green. Do keep in mind that if you mix green and pink, you're probably going to get some shade of brown. And I may drop some green into one of the pinks here and there and see what we get. Just be aware that it is going to be more of a brown color if you mix those two. So I've cleaned off my brush. And I'm going to drag a little bit of this yellow paint over towards the pink. Clean off my brush. I'm going to drag a little bit of pink into the yellow. And I'm just going to mix those two together, and I'm going to get an orangey color. Whether it's more yellow orange or pink orange depends on how much of which color you have. And you can just keep dragging paint in until it looks like an orange color that you want. I'm going to put this one up here. So I'm going to match the contour of the one above it, leaving just a little bit of a white line in between as a separation line. And I really should be doing this with my bigger brush. I'm going to switch to that here in a minute because it will be easier. And how do I know it will be easier? Because as I'm painting, this is drying out as I'm doing it, and that's telling me I'm using a brush that's too small for my space, and it's not holding enough water. That's how I know I need to switch to a bigger brush. So I followed the contour line of the pink and left just a little bit of a space in between. So I got a little white break, but then I made the bottom be a different shape altogether. So it's not a carbon copy of the one above it. So I'm going to rinse off this brush and set it aside, and I'm going to grab my bigger brush, which is what I should have been using to begin with. This is going to hold more water, so as I'm painting those contours, I'm not having to go back and dip in my water quite as much. Okay? So I'm going to dip that in just plain water, get a little bit wet. That will help it hold the paint. And I think I'm going to, over here on my palette, I'm going to grab some of this yellow from that puddle, put it in the middle, and add a little bit of pink to it. But I think I'm going to put more pink in this time, and I'm just going to keep dragging that yellow in. So I've got a little more of a pinky orange instead of orange. And I'm just going to keep dragging those paints together until I get kind of the shade that I want. And I'm going to come down and put that one on the bottom. And all I'm doing is just kind of varying my colors. I don't want all my pinks together. I don't want all my yellows together. I don't want all my oranges together. So I'm doing essentially the same thing I did up above. I'm following the contour, but I'm going to make my top line different. And then just fill it in with the rest of that color. And you can see with that bigger brush, it fills in faster. My paper has stayed wet. Now I am going to clean off my brush and come back with just some plain water, and I'm going to dip it in there again and make some of those pretty blooms. So this time, I think I'm going to go full green with this one. So with a clean brush dipped in water, I'm going to pull a little bit of that green paint out just so I can water it down a little bit. And this time I'm going to go back up here. And this particular green really has kind of a yellow hue to it, so it's kind of a yellow green anyway. But I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to follow the contour of the one above it for the top line. My bottom contour line is going to be different, and there's no real right or wrong to it. You can make that bottom line be whatever you want it to be. Maybe we'll do something like that. And with this one, I'm going to clean my brush off and go dip it in a little bit of my pink paint, and I'm going to do like I did on this yellow. I'm going to just dab a little bit of pink paint in here. Now keep in mind that when you do this, because this one is essentially a green, even though it's a real yellow green, you might get some browns out of this, which is okay. I'm fine with that. So I'm going to rinse my brush off, and then I'm going to come back and just kind of drag those around a little bit to mix them together, merge them together, and hopefully on the camera you can see as I did that, that's really quite a brown color. It's kind of a pinky brown, but it is brown, and that's fine. That's kind of like a dirt color, and we have that in spring. So I'm good with that. I'm going to rinse my brush off, and I think I'm going to come back with another pink one right here, and then maybe we'll do another yellow one right here. So this time I'm just grabbing full strength pink with a clean brush. It'll just be a little darker pink than the one above was. And I'm going to do the same thing. Follow the contour of the line above it, and then make your own bottom contour line. And this time, just for fun, I'm going to rinse off my brush and grab a little bit of this yellow and just dab my yellow in here, just like we did the pink up here and the green down here. And there's really no rhyme or reason to where I'm dabbing it. All that's doing is introducing another color on top of the color that you've used, and that just gives it a little bit of depth. So hopefully you can see what that's doing where I'm adding those colors. It's just giving a little bit of texture, a little bit of depth to the paint. Look at this. Look at the bloom in this orange. Oh, I love it when it does that. A lot of people try to avoid the blooms, particularly people who are doing more realistic watercolor painting. And that's part of why I absolutely hated watercolor when I first started learning it, because I could not control those blooms. And I finally decided, screw it. The blooms are pretty, so they're just going to be there, so let's use them. So I now create those blooms on purpose by putting the dots of water in there. All right, what do we think we want to do this time? Let's do some yellow, and I'm just mixing it in a little bit of this orange that I have here, so it's going to kind of be a light peachy color. And I'm just going to fill it in the space that's left. So on this one, I'm matching both contours, top and bottom. And again, just leaving a little bit of white space in between. Now, if your hand's not very steady and you bumped into the one above it or below it and the colors bled together a little bit, that's perfectly fine. It's not going to hurt anything. It just changes the look a little bit, but it's certainly not wrong. I've done some that way on purpose, and I think it's kind of a cool look. So if you bumped them together and they bled together a little bit, completely okay. Okay, so there we go. So far, there's all my layers. I've used 3 colors and the mixes of those colors to get some gradient changes and a different look, and it's got that springtime feel to it. So now I'm going to paint my sun and my sky. To do that, I'm going to flip this around so it's at a better angle for me, and I'm not dragging my hand through wet paint. Okay, so I'm going to turn this around. For my sun, I want my full strength yellow because I want it to be really vibrant. So I'm going to switch to my smaller brush just because I have a smaller space, and I'm going to come straight out of my pan for that yellow because I want it to be full strength and I want it to be vibrant. So I've just dipped my brush in water. I'm going to swirl it around in that yellow paint, pick up a good amount of paint, and I'm going to paint my sun. Now when I do my sun, for the bottom of my sun, right here where it's next to the top layer, I'm going to leave that little bit of white space again. So I've got just a little bit of separation. And then I'm going to fill in that half circle that I made in the full strength, really vibrant yellow. Makes me think of that warm spring sun. And I don't know about where you all are, but we had snow last night. Today the wind is blowing really hard, so even though our thermometer says it's 42 degrees with a wind chill, it's closer to 32, so it's still pretty cold. We've got snow in the forecast for the next couple of days, so I'm really dreaming about this warm sun. So there we go. Sun's painted in. We need to do the sky now, and I'm going to switch back to my bigger brush because I've got a bigger space to cover. When we paint the sky, we're going to do the same thing. Coming around the sun, we're going to leave a little bit of white space so that we've got that same separation line all the way through. So if your hand is a little shaky and you're having trouble freehanding those little lines in between, you might want to let this dry first, because if you had some of these run together, that's really okay because those are kind of all in the same, what's the word I want? Just went right out of my head. They're kind of all in the same color palette that we're using, but we don't want the blue to bleed into the yellow because then that will turn our sun green, and we don't want that. So if you feel like you're a little unsure about painting around that sun and maintaining that little line of separation, dry this first before you do that, okay? And that will prevent the blue and the yellow from blurring together. So I cleaned my brush. Coming back to my big brush, I'm just going to grab some of this blue that I have on my plate over here. And because this is a daytime sky, I want it to be fairly light. So I'm going to leave my line of white space there. I'm going to leave my line of white space around my sun. And I'm just painting in some of this blue. I'm going to come back and grab some water and use the water to spread it around, because that water is going to help thin it out, and thinning it out will make it lighter. I need a little more paint, so I'm going to go back to my plate and get a little more paint. Finish that line around my sun. A little white space for separation. Same thing right there. And there we go. Now I'm not being really careful to smooth out my paint in the sky. I'm leaving some spots where it's a little darker, and you can purposely go back and grab a little more paint and kind of dab some paint here and there so you have some darker spots and some lighter spots, just so we have a little bit of interest in the sky. It's not just a flat color. Okay, so I'm going to flip this back around. So that's essentially the paint part of our summer scene. While this is drying, I'm going to go over and do that same thing for my night scene. And then when both of them are done, we'll let them dry and we'll come back and do some embellishments on top of it. So I'm essentially going to do the same thing. I'm just going to use a different color palette. So this is where I'm going to grab my other plate. If you've just got one plate, you'll want to wash that one off. I love using these because you can just run it under some water, maybe run your hand over it real quick, and all that paint comes right off. It doesn't stain the plates. The only time I've ever had watercolor stain a plate is when I was using a handmade ceramic plate and the glazing had cracked a little bit and the paint settled in that glazing, and so I had lines all over it. But if you're using something like Corelle plates or most of the commercially produced dinner plates, that glazing is not going to be cracked, so these just rinse right off. So, clean plate. For my night scene, I'm going to use some pink again. So I'm going to do essentially the same thing. I'm just going to drop some pink splotches on my plate to use. And these dried out a little bit while I was painting, so I'm just dipping my brush in water to put a little bit more water in that pan. I'm going to rinse my brush and I'm going to get some purple. Because for my nighttime scene, oops, I just dripped purple paint all over my table. For my nighttime scene, think dark blues, purples, pinks. So I'm going to make a couple splotches of purple paint and wipe up that. And then for my third color, there's a different blue in this particular palette. If you don't have a different blue, you could use the same one you used for the sky. We'll just use it a little stronger pigment. We won't dilute it down quite as much. This one does happen to have a darker blue, so I'm going to use that darker blue. And because, well, actually I'm going to do 2 puddles of each color. And there's really no rhyme or reason or specific point to 2 puddles. It just gives me stuff to play with. All right, so I'm gonna clean off my brush. We're gonna do basically the same thing on this side, only we're gonna use the more nighttime colors. So I'm gonna pick what color I want for my top and what color I want for my bottom. Doesn't really matter. The only reason I used pink for the top on this one is because I knew my sun was gonna be yellow and I didn't want my yellows together. So pink gives it a little bit of contrast. The moon's gonna be white, so it doesn't matter what you use at the top. The only consideration might be your sky. Our sky is going to be kind of a dark blue, so maybe you want to do like a pinky blue or a pinky purple up here at the top, something lighter, or even full-on pink would work. I think for what I'm going to do, I'm going to drag over a little bit of pink over here, and I'm going to put just a little bit of purple in it. So it kind of makes it more of a lavender color. And I'm going to let that be my top. So just like we did on the other one. I'm going to paint that in with the top line following my horizon contour. And the bottom, you get to decide how that bottom of that line looks. Okay? I think at the bottom I want to have a little more of a blue. So I clean my brush. And I'm coming back with just plain water to water that down a little bit so that it lightens up a little. And I'm going to do the same thing. You decide what your top contour line looks like. The bottom obviously is going to be where the tape is, so we don't need to do anything there. And with this one, I'm going to put some of those blooms in it. So rinse your brush and come back with just plain water and just dab it into the blue here and there. If you really like the blooms, you could do that on every single one of them if you want to. I don't want to because I'm going to show you some other things we're going to embellish. So I don't want those blooms in absolutely everything. So let's do maybe a purple one, a full purple one. But this purple is a really strong pigment in this particular palette. So I'm going to water this down a good bit. So I just cleaned my brush, come back with plain water. Pull it away from the main pile of paint a little bit so you've got more water than paint. And we'll do the same thing. Follow that top contour, leaving a little bit of space. and you get to decide what the top part looks like. Now for this one, just for the fun of it, I'm going to grab a little bit of that pink I used and dab it in. Again, just to give it a little bit of color, a little bit of interest. I think I'm going to go that darker purple again up here by the lavender. So cleaned off my brush, came back with plain water. I'm not going to water it down quite as much this time. I'm going to leave it a little more full strength purple so I get that darker look to it. Where this is a nighttime scene on this side, I do want it to be a little darker, kind of a little moodier. So I'm going to use that purple a little more full strength. Fill that whole thing in. I think in this one I'm going to grab a little bit of the blue, and I'm just going to tap a little bit of the blue in here and there. For down here, I think I'm going to mix a little bit of my blue and my pink. So with a clean brush, I just picked up a little bit of that blue, mixed it in with the pink. Again, you're going to get kind of a lavendery thing because blues and pinks, purples and pinks are all going to lead you to lavender if they're watered down. It's just, some of it's going to have a little more blue tint, some of it's going to have a little more purple tint depending on what you start with. So all of these colors mix really well together. And I'm not mixing. Okay, flipped over. So I'm at a better painting angle for myself and I'm not dragging my hand through that wet paint. My moon, I'm going to leave white on this one. So I'm not actually going to paint that. I'm just going to do a dark sky behind it. And we're going to do it essentially the same way. We're going to paint along here, around here, here, leaving that little white line of separation and everything darker up here. So I'm going to go with much more blue as I'm doing this one because I want it to be darker, and I'm probably going to come back and dip some purple in it up around the corners so that I get a nice dark night sky. So I'm just grabbing all this darker blue, not really watering it down much. And when I get it on there, it's not dark enough compared to my daytime one for me. So I'm just going to go over to my pan and grab a little bit more paint on this brush and smear that in. And you can see when I put that on there, it might make you go, ooh, because it's really dark. But this is all still wet. So even with that initial dark splotch that I put on there, I'm just going to use my brush to move it around. And as you spread all that dark around, it does lighten up a little bit. And keep in mind that watercolor dries lighter than it looks when it's wet. So I've got some nice dark contrast there. Now the other thing I'm going to do with this is just go grab a little bit of purple off my plate, and I'm going to kind of tip in some purple up here around the top so we get the idea of moon's coming up and the sky's getting darker as you look farther off in the sky. And I'm just tapping it here and there. I'm not really painting in any kind of design. I'm just tapping it in the sky. As that dries, that's going to give me kind of a purpley blue mottled effect, which gives it a little bit of dimension. Okay, so there we go. We have springtime, daytime, we have nighttime, and this one almost feels more wintry with kind of those cool colors. So it's kind of a nice juxtaposition. I love the two of them together. So set this aside and let it dry, or go hit it with a blow dryer. Just keep in mind, if you've got spots of really wet paint, you want to hold your blow dryer up a good distance from it, because if you get the blow dryer too close, that blow dryer is pushing air. It's going to push your paint around and might make the paint do things you don't want to do. So hold your blow dryer up good and far away from it if you're going to do that. We'll let this dry and then we'll come back and do all the embellishments, okay? Alrighty, mine is dried. Hopefully yours is too. For the rest of this, we don't need it to be taped down, and I want to be able to do some work on the borders. So I'm going to take the tape off of this and pull it off the board. Excuse me. We are still going to paint a little bit on here and there for some of the embellishments, but it's not going to be big swatches of really wet paint. So I'm going to go ahead and rip the tape off of mine. Go ahead and do the same on yours. Remember when you're peeling your tape off to pull it back at a really extreme angle. This one in the center is a little tricky to do away from the painting because it's going right up the middle. So just do it slowly. Your tape on the edges, remember when you're peeling it away, come on, pull it away from the painting. You can see I'm pulling this up and away from the painting. And the reason I do that is because even though this particular tape is really good about not ripping the paper, it still does on occasion. So if it rips that paper, if I'm pulling away from the painting, it's going to rip this way. If I'm pulling it towards the painting, it's going to rip into my painting and mess up what I've done, and I don't want it to do that. So if you pull the tape off away from the painting, even if the paper does rip a little bit, you can generally avoid damaging the painting itself. So I'm going to pull this off all the way around. Remember, go a little bit slowly to minimize ripping. And you may notice as we're pulling this tape off that the paint may have bled underneath your tape here and there. Part of what we're going to do with the border is going to take care of that and disguise it. And you could also take something like a white Posca pen and just paint right over it. This piece here in the middle, I don't know if you can see that. You can see where I've got that little bit that bled under the tape. That's, my border is not going to cover any of that, so I'm just going to take my white Posca pen and paint over it because I'm on white paper. You paint over it with the white Posca pen, it just pretty much disappears. You can see the pen a little bit because it's wet. Sometimes if it's a really dark color, you might have to go over it again, but that's a really good way to disguise any spots where the paint might have slipped underneath the tape. Okay. Actually, I'm going to zoom you in pretty close right here. So what I'm going to do now is take one of my black pens and I'm going to outline and do the border, and I'm also going to create some separation where these white lines are. I kind of like that white line look, but the more I look at it now, I think it needs a little bit more definition. And so that's what we're going to do. If you want to know a little secret, I rarely do a test painting before I do these videos, so a lot of this is trial and error while I'm doing the video. I get an idea in my head, and just because of time constraints, I don't often paint it first. So this is the first time I've done this one, so we're kind of making it up as we go. And you have that freedom too, as you're looking at your paintings. If you feel like it needs something added to it, add it. I liked the idea of the white lines, but now that I see them, I think they need a little bit of definition. So that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to use the finer point of the two black pens that I have. This one is the Uniball Deluxe Micro. It's a real nice fine point. I think it's a 0.3 or something close to that. Ballpoint waterproof gel pen. So what I'm going to do with this is right around my border, I'm going to do kind of a wonky border. So I'm going to have some straight spots, and then I'm going to do some zigzags and some curly cues here and there. And just really make this kind of a funky border all the way around. Now what this is going to do is disguise some of those spots where the paint bled underneath the tape. You can put a swirly or something like that over the top of it and be able to disguise some of the spots where maybe there's paint underneath the tape. It also gives it kind of a fun look. You could also come back then and maybe add some dots here and there, just something to add a little more character. If you've been with me a while, you know that my style is pretty whimsical, so I like to put in a lot of things that don't make sense. So I'm going to do that kind of border all the way around both of them. The other thing that I'm going to do is come in and outline these white spaces. And I'm just doing it very lightly. I don't want it to be a real thick black line. So I'm just really lightly outlining my white spaces. And if your lines are a little bit wonky, you go in off the color a little bit. That's perfectly okay. And remember that you can turn your paper while you're doing this so that you've got a better drawing angle for yourself. That way you're not trying to draw at an angle that's really uncomfortable for you. So I'm going to zoom you back out. You see that even just that little bit adds kind of a finishing touch to it. So I'm going to speed up the video from here and do this the rest of the way around both of them and where all the white lines are. So you do the same, and then we'll come back and talk about some additional embellishments, okay? Okay, so we've got our lines drawn. If you have spots like this one where your two colors touch together and one bled up through, you can just continue that line straight on through it as if it wasn't even there. It really isn't going to make any difference. So I'm going to do some additional embellishments on my sun. I'm going to add some rays. I'm going to add some birds in the sky. I'm going to put a little curlicue in the moon, and we'll put some stars up here. So I am going to use my white Posca pen on some of these darker areas. The white will show up nicely there. On the lighter areas, I'll use my black pen. And I'm really just going to set about filling these in with different things that are just kind of nonsensical and fun. I am going to pull some paint off of both of these plates that I used. I'll use my smaller brush to do that, to add some embellishments in. For instance, I could use this really dark purple on the pink or the light blue, and there'll be a nice contrast. Some of these have started to dry out. If yours have as well, you can just dip your brush in water and put some water on the paint, stir it back up with your brush, and it'll reconstitute and be ready to use again. That's the other thing I like about using these plates, particularly if they're colors you use a lot of. When you're done painting, you can just leave them there and let them dry. And then just put some water on them with your brush, scrub them around a little bit with your brush when you're ready to use them again, and they're ready to go, just like they are straight out of your pan. So let's put some rays on our sun. I'm going to do them at varying heights, and I'm going to let them be a little bit wonky. They're not going to be perfectly straight because, again, the wonkiness is part of the fun of it. I don't want it to be absolutely perfect. And for the birds, I'm just going to make little curled V's. But do make them going in kind of different directions here and there, because birds aren't always flying in the same direction. So you can see I just did kind of a little curved V here and there, and that makes it look like there's some birds. For my night sky, I'm going to put some stars. So I'm going to take my white Posca pen, and I'm just going to make some random dots all over in my sky like stars. You could sprinkle some white acrylic paint to do the same thing, but I wouldn't want to take a chance on it getting on the rest of my painting, so I'm just going to do it with my Posca pen. And then the other thing I'm going to do is make a couple of bigger stars. Sometimes when you take pictures of stars or you look at them through a camera lens or something like that, you kind of get that little lens flare. So I'm going to put like a little cross on a couple of these, just to make them stand out a little bit more in my night sky. I'm not going to do that on a lot of them. I just want a couple of some accents. Usually when I do things like that, I try to make them odd numbers because odd numbers tend to be a little more visually appealing. So now I'm going to start filling in all my other spots. And I think maybe this pink, actually this purple, is probably a good candidate for the white. I think it'll show up really well. And what I'm going to do with this one is just make lines through the shape from top to bottom that kind of follow this top contour. And as I'm doing that, when I get to the bottom, you know, obviously my bottom contour is a little different, so I'm just going to do them as best they fit that contour. So I'm just going to do like this. There's no rhyme or reason to this. You're just going to use shapes and designs that you think are fun. And I'm going to go through and do this same thing to all of my shapes. I think I'm going to do it over here on this pink one. Is that pink one, the white should show up okay, but instead of going horizontally with it, I'm going to go vertically. And if your lines are a little bit wonky, if they're not completely straight, that's absolutely okay. Wonky is my favorite word. think the wonky factor adds personality to it. So there's some white ones. I think I'm gonna do the same thing with black, only maybe go the other direction. So maybe I'm gonna do the same, like I did here with the white, I'm gonna do the same thing with the black down here in this one. And the reason I'm doing it down here, I could reasonably do it in this one up here because this is fairly light too, but I don't want my stripes right next to each other. I want them to be kind of random and not the same thing in every space next to each other. So you can repeat the same shapes. I would just try and make sure they're somewhere else so you don't end up with stripes and stripes, or horizontal stripes and horizontal stripes, and vertical stripes and vertical stripes, and you know, all the same thing right next to each other, because then it starts to look a little manufactured and a little too patterny. And if we're talking about whimsical, there is no pattern. No pattern is better. So there's my lines there. I think I'm gonna put some spirals in my moon. One big one. So I'm gonna start in the middle and just spiral my way out. And when I get to that bottom border, I'm going to lift my pen up and pretend the spiral's continuing. So that I fill the whole thing. And then I think I'm going to put one big dot right in the middle. That just gives my moon a little bit of personality because it was feeling like kind of a big white blob there. So now I'm going to pull in some of my paint and use my paint to add some embellishments in here. And I'm going to try to do this without dragging my hand through it once I get it on there, because I am notorious for dragging my hand through wet paint. If you drag your hand through some wet paint at this point, there's really not a whole lot you can do to fix it. So I'm going to try and be careful. So I added a little bit of water to this purple on my plate that was drying, the dark purple. And I am just going to make some big circles in this top one. And what I'm trying to do is layer the darker colors on top of the lighter colors. Because the nature of watercolor is that it is semi-transparent most of the time, it's really hard to put a lighter watercolor on top of a darker one. So I'm putting my darker ones on top of my lighter ones. And that way I don't have a problem with it not showing up. So I've got 3 big circles there, and I'm going to do some smaller ones just to vary the size a little bit, give it a little more interest. And if they're not perfectly round, that is completely okay. We're back to the wonky factor. So I've got some smaller ones, and I think now all I'm going to do is just put some paint on my brush and just tap it here and there to make some even smaller spots. And just randomly. There we go. I think I'm going to come down here. Maybe to this blue, and I'm going to use that same purple paint and my small brush, and I'm going to do some vertical lines down here with the paint. So they're going to be a little thicker than the pen lines are, but I'm just going to use that little tip of my brush. So I'm not pressing very hard, it's just very light pressure, and make some vertical lines on top of that lighter blue. And you will vary where you're putting your colors based on where your dark and lights are. Again, you're putting the darker colors on top of the lighter ones. Now looking at that, those are a little far away, so I'm going to come back and just put some smaller pieces of lines in between just to fill up some of that space. And I'm going to do essentially the same thing over here. Swap my plates. I've got my pink and my green and my yellow on this other plate. So I'm going to do pretty much the same thing. I've just dipped my brush in water, cleaned it off, dipped it in water, adding some water to this pink puddle that had started to dry. And I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna add some circles down here. How many and how big is completely up to you. I do just like to make sure I've got a variety of sizes because that makes it a little more interesting. And I'm just taking my time, putting my dots on. Again, with these bigger ones, try and make them odd numbers. And it's just a visual appeal kind of thing. And then same thing, I'm gonna come back and just tap my brush here and there to add some smaller dots all around it. As you feel your brush start to, oh, almost did it. That was lucky. Oh my goodness, that brush almost went right through those wet dots. That would have been a mess. Holy cow. So what I was starting to say is as you feel your brush running out of paint, just go back to that plate, pick up some more, and keep adding dots until you feel like you've got enough. There's really no golden rule. Oh, look what happened. When I dropped that brush, I got a splop of pink over here. So what am I gonna do about that? Well, I'm gonna put some pink something in that guy to cover it up. Because this is a fairly light color, that dark pink will show up on top of that with no problem. So the question becomes, what am I gonna put over there? Maybe we'll put some pink stars. Now, if you would rather make your stars, if you want to do stars, if you'd rather do them with a pen, go ahead. I'm using my brush to cover up a spot that I made when that brush fell. If you're going to do it with your brush, because these are fairly small, you're just going to use very light pressure. If you put more pressure on it, it's going to make a wider line, and then they sometimes end up looking like just big blobs instead of the shape you're intending them to look like. So there we go. And I think for this, I'm just going to add some more little dot embellishments, but instead of doing them randomly like I've done in other spots, I'm just going to do 3 little ones together in kind of a little triangle shape of sorts. Here and there. There we go. So that covers up the mess that I almost made by dropping that brush. That was almost a catastrophe. I'm gonna leave, I think, a few of these with nothing in them. So maybe I'll leave this one blank. And this one over here has some of these really nice blooms in it. So I think I might just take my pen and do some spirals inside those blooms. Again, being careful not to drag my hand through that wet paint. And I'm going to vary the size of my spirals based on the size of those blooms. So in some of the bigger blooms, I'll do some bigger spirals. And in the smaller ones, some smaller spirals. So when I do that, it leaves me some space right here where there's nothing. Looks a little funny, so I'm just going to add some spirals there, even though there's no blooms there. The blooms just give me a place to start. So we've got the spirals. I started them in the bloom spots and then filled in around it to the point that it made me happy, made my eye happy to look at it. Okay. I'm going to flip this around just a little bit so that I'm working on this side without having my hand go through anything wet. And I'm going to put, I think I want some little suns in this one. So I'm just going to do some random circles to start with. And I'm using shapes that are just screaming at me right now. You can use whatever shapes, whatever designs in yours that you want to. And on these little suns, I'm just going to start putting some rays. So they're nothing complicated. They're not even really anything terribly fancy. But when you start putting lots of little things, even if they're not fancy, together, those individual little not fancy pieces combine over the size of the whole thing to make it look a little fancier. Now those suns are feeling a little bit plain for me. And those of you who've been with me a while know I like busy things. So I added some dots in the middle of my little suns, just to give them a little more pizzazz. I think I would like to have some of these spirals over here as well. I don't want to do them here, again, because I don't want them right across from each other. So I'm going to go here or here. And I think I'm going to do them on this one because the spirals next to the round suns maybe feels like a little bit too much round to me. So I'm just going to do my spirals like I did on the other side. I don't really have a place to start with them like I did with the blooms on the other side. So I'm just randomly putting them in different sizes. No rhyme or reason. Just kind of filling the space up with them. And you'll notice as I'm doing this, I keep turning my paper around, and it's just simply to give me a better drawing angle and to keep my hand away from all these wet spots. If I can make it through this without dragging my hand through that, it will be a complete success. Let's see, do we think we're done? I don't know, what do you think? I'm kind of thinking we're almost done. I don't have anything up here, but I've got those nice blooms. So I think I might leave those alone. Oh, no, what? You know what? I changed my mind. Like I said, I didn't plan this ahead of time. I'm making it up as I go. I'm going to zoom in so you can see this one better, though. See these nice pretty blooms and how they have kind of a shape to them? I'm going to trace those a little bit, I think, and see what that ends up looking like. So I'm just loosely tracing the shape of that bloom. So they're really just gonna look like kind of big splotches of, I don't know, weird stuff. But I'm completely okay with splotches of weird stuff. That's what makes it fun to me. And you don't have to follow them exactly. Sometimes there's a lot of little lines and it's hard to follow them exactly, so close enough is close enough. It gives you the general idea of it. Oh, I kind of like that. Almost looks like leopard spots or something. Cool. I do think I want it a little bit fancier, so I'm going to put just a few little dots here and there inside the outlines of those blooms. Just to give them a little something. Again, there's no rhyme or reason to any of this embellishment. You're looking at your painting and deciding for yourself how much you want on it. If you liked it the way it was before we started any of the embellishments, when it was just simple with a border and the lines between, you could have stopped there. That would have been perfectly okay. This is all, you know, from the point we've got the painting done, it's all completely personal preference as far as how much stuff you put in there. So I think I think we're about done. I think the last thing I'm going to do is come back with my Posca pen and put some white dots in some of these bigger ones, just simply because that will make them pop a little bit more. They are not completely dry yet, so if you have these big dots and you want to put some white in them, stop right here and let it dry, or go hit it with the blow dryer, which I'm going to do, and then I'll come back and finish those off. Okay, back with mine dry. So what I'm going to do is take my pen and just put like some little comma shapes in these great big ones and little dots in the medium ones. I'm not going to worry about the real tiny ones because those are going to be hard to, the pen's the same size as those little ones, so you wouldn't get the same effect. I'm going to do the same thing down here with my red ones. Commas in the big ones, dots in the smaller ones. And I think, as I'm looking at these now, I think I want to put a little bit of an outline around these big ones and the medium ones. So I'm just going to draw a circle around them, but I'm not going to adhere very closely to the shape itself. So we end up with something that looks like that, which is just kind of fun. It's not exactly the same shape as the circle. That's okay. I think I'm going to do the same thing to the purple ones up here. And at this point, I'm just doing these random little things because it feels like, to my eye, it needs just a little bit of something else. And I think my stars the same way. They're just screaming to me that they need a little something. So I'm just going to outline the stars real loosely. And I'm probably going to come back with that white pen and put a little dot in them as well. It's always amazing to me how something as simple as a little white highlight can just really make something pop out when it didn't before. And I'll show you what I mean. When you look at this whole thing, when we looked at it a minute ago, those purple dots and the red dots down here just kind of, you could still see them, but they kind of blended back into the background a little bit. These down here, same thing. They're not invisible, but your eye is not drawn to them as much as it is to some of the other things. So when I come in and put a little bit of a white dot in the middle of it, because that white dot is such a contrast to what was there, all of a sudden they have a little bit of pizzazz and they stand out. And I think I'm going to add a little bit of white down here for the same reason. On both sides of where I've got these little in-between lines, I'm going to put dots of white. Now they're not going to show up as well as they do on the red, simply because this is a lighter color. But all of these little things combined work together to add visual interest to it. There we go. You see those little white dots in there? Now I'm going to come back and put some dots in the middle of my spirals for the same reason. They just kind of, they're not really standing out as much as I want them to. And I'm going to use my little bigger pen just because it makes it a little bit easier to cover more space. And I'm just going to put a black dot right in the middle of each of them. Nothing fancy. But like I said, all of these little things, when you put them all together, they work to create interesting things for your eye to look at. I'm going to do the same thing with these spirals over here. It just gives them that little bit more of visual interest. There we go. So now those stand out just a little bit more than they did before. So I'm just kind of stepping back periodically. What I'm actually doing is looking at it through the camera. That's an interesting way to assess your painting. If you're standing and looking at it in person and you're not quite sure if you need to do more or not, take a picture of it and then look at it. Look at the picture because it looks a little bit different. Set it across the room and then stand back 10 feet from it and take a look at it. Your eye will be drawn to the places you think you need something else, and you can decide what you want to add there. So I think for right now, I'm going to call this done. I I may or may not come back later and add some more to it. I don't know. But I think it looks pretty good for now. And hopefully it's been a little bit of a different kind of project for you than we've done in the past. I try to come up with new things for you so that you don't get bored with what we're doing. And we've always got interesting projects. Do remember to sign your painting. If you've got other spots that you noticed the paint bleed under the tape, you can use something like a white Posca pen to draw over it and remove those. Because I started on a 9x12 piece of paper, if I wanted to, I could take this and just put it in a 9x12 frame and be good to go. I've got my daytime, my nighttime, kind of an interesting juxtaposition. If you wanted, you could cut it up the middle, put them in 2 separate frames. You could use them as bookmarks. Excuse me, if you do this on a smaller scale, you could even do this on the front of like watercolor greeting cards or something like that. And it would be a fun little thing to do. You don't have to do both of them. You could do maybe just one side for a greeting card or bookmark, something like that. So lots of different things you could do with this. Yeah, I think we'll call that one done. So hopefully you enjoyed that. If you did, share it with any friends who you know who might enjoy it. Subscribe to my channel so that you can get notified whenever there's new videos. And if you want to follow along with more artsy stuff, I am at Painted Willow Art on both Instagram and Pinterest. Pinterest, I've got a lot of inspiration pins saved for you in different categories. Watercolor is one of them, doodling is another one. So there's all kinds of stuff there for you to get ideas and inspiration from. And I think on that note, we will call it good. I will put all the supplies that I used in the description of the video so that you can see what they are. Even though we talked about them at the beginning, you'll have a reference there. And as always, if you have any questions, please put those in the comments as well, and I will get to those as quickly as I can. So hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for being here, and I'll see y'all on the next one.